Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm pleased to have an opportunity to take a call on the second reading of the Infrastructure Bill. And before I get into my speech, I want to offer my congratulations to the Green member for his very useful contribution and his first contribution to a bill in the House. Now, as former speakers have said, Labor supports this bill, but we did not vote for Part 4 in the Select Committee, and as other speakers have already outlined that, and we hope that we'll be able to address our concerns when we come to the committee stages. But it's also fair to say, Mr Speaker, even though we're supporting the bill, that we have serious concerns about what this government actually means by infrastructure development. Now, the purpose of the bill is to progress a suite of amendments to facilitate infrastructure development, but given the scenario in Auckland at the moment, one has to wonder whether this is achievable. The population growth in Auckland makes the challenges of infrastructure, economic development and good planning even more urgent. But unfortunately, Mr Speaker, Aucklanders are not having a real say in their future, and the way National Act are ramming through their version of a super city, a narrow and influential elite will determine how Auckland's infrastructure develops. What happens in Auckland has a major influence on the rest of the country. That influence will grow even more in the future. It is crucial that the many, not the few, determine how this happens. Mr Speaker, the first part of this bill is about implementing a national code of practice governing how utility operators and transport corridor managers coordinate their activities. What we are talking about here is installing telecommunications, electricity, gas and water along the roading and rail corridors of New Zealand. IPENS, one of these submitters, described the current arrangement for the roading corridors being effectively a commons, where all parties have the absolute right of access without charge, subject to conditions. So roads are the common of modern urban society. Many of our utilities under the roads and rail corridor go back. They go way back to the days when government owned the utility operations and companies. But the sell-off and privatisation over the years means that coordination and national consistency has become much more complex. These days, local authorities, the New Zealand Transport Agency and rail licence access providers are all corridor managers. The councils own the road corridor, but they can't stop people digging it up. One submitter told us that they literally don't know what's under the ground in some parts of the country and some parts of the corridor, which makes the job of the local authorities very difficult indeed. But there were, at the Select Committee, plenty of complaints from utility managers as well. Coordination and national consistency were described to the Select Committee as the Holy Grail, but I think that's a big ask in any legislation. And to be honest, Mr Speaker, I'm a little bit cynical because apparently this code has been under development for many, many years by the New Zealand Utilities Advisory Group. And there appears to have been some falling out of some of the parties, and some don't participate at all. While there was general support from utilities operators for an industry-led code and agreement about the need to make arrangements as consistent as possible across utilities and corridor managers, local authorities had more reservations and concerns. Several submitters thought the bill could go further in making arrangements more consistent, but there is definitely a divide in opinion between utility operators and corridor managers on several issues. Utility operators have rights of access to local authority-controlled roads, but that has to be balanced, Mr Speaker, against corridor managers' responsibilities for controlling the road. Corridor managers need to have the ability to direct how the work is done, as they are responsible for that amenity and also the safety of the public and indeed the contractors that are doing the work. The code will include rules setting out how work must be done, which will give utility operators the ability to ensure that work is done in a way that does not damage their assets. A code can be prepared and presented to the Minister for approval by anyone, although I have to say this was queried by the Select Committee. It seems strange to us that anyone could be preparing a code. However, the bill requires proper consultation and for the code to be broadly agreed to by relevant corridor managers and utility operators and to reflect a balance of interests between corridor managers and those operators. The Select Committee has made a number of recommendations in regard to the strengthening of the enforceability of the code, which Labor supports. Mr Speaker, since this bill was introduced, many questions have emerged about transport infrastructure in Auckland. Auckland is very concerned about the role of the undemocratic nature of the powerful new transport agency in the Auckland Super City. There's been warnings that Auckland's local roads are likely to suffer in the mix between the government's control from Wellington and their desire for and their so-called roads of national significance, of which there are 3 in Auckland. The require that the agency deals with all roading issues, including whether there are speed bumps or better footpaths in local streets, is quite frankly bizarre. 80% of the work of community boards in Auckland is street-related. Footpaths, car parking, slow roads, bus shelters, traffic conflicts and so on. Yet all of this, plus all the determination of the huge asset of Auckland's transport infrastructure, is being handed over to an unaccountable group of Rodney Hyde's mates. I'm foreseeing that transport will be a huge election issue this year come the Super City elections, and it will be interesting to watch how the candidates, including the mayoral candidates, play out their competing promises in the campaign. It's hard to see, however, how the new mayor and those who are elected to the new Auckland Council will have any power to actually implement their transport policies. So since this bill was introduced, we've had the grand infrastructure plan, and I do have to say it's great to talk about roads and railways and other things. The part that's always missing for me in any infrastructure plan that comes from this government is the people element. Surely people are part of our infrastructure, skills and education. Doesn't seem so. But I do say, Mr Speaker, we now know why the Kopu Bridge was rushed through with the mining announcements that we've had in the last couple of days. At the same time, there's increasing uncertainty around the government's commitment to rail, with closures of some regional lines in the wind. There were a number of utility operators who complained to the Select Committee about not having as of right access to rail corridors, saying it inhibits their ability to develop infrastructure. And it was explained, Mr Speaker, to the Select Committee that the rail corridor is different to the roading corridor. It has specific health and safety requirements. The Kiwi Rail and OnTrack are responsible for workers and contractors. There are a few alternative routes, and most of the network is a single track. So we're pretty concerned, Mr Speaker, that Stephen Choice is planning to mothball some parts of the rail network as a precursor to the sell-off. Well, you can stand up and say it's not going to happen if you like, Mr Henare. A precursor to sell-off Kiwi Rail in their second term, and then the utility operators are going to have a field day. So we're going to watch with keen interest the government's plans to amend the Railways Act, which is foreshadowed in this bill. This bill, Mr Speaker, is about the things that New Zealanders believe are their rights to a decent living, transport and utilities. It's an important bill, and as I said, we will be supporting parts 1 to 3, and I'll talk about the housing in a moment, but I do predict that the transport and infrastructure issues are going to get hotter and hotter for this government, and that's without even talking about Great Barrier Island. Now, moving on to part 4, my colleagues have already said that we're opposed to the repeal of the Affordable Housing Enabling Territorial Authorities Act. It should not have been hidden away in this bill, Mr Speaker. It should have been sent to the appropriate Select Committee. I think it's absolutely shameful that the appropriate Select Committee is not going to have the opportunity to discuss housing affordability and how that piece of legislation is going to work. The decision to repeal the Act without such consideration is a wasted opportunity and further limits the tools available to address housing affordability in New Zealand. So we're hoping when it comes to the committee stages, Mr Speaker, that we'll be able to vote separately. We'll put in amendments in the committee stages, and in the third reading vote separately on part 4 from the rest of the bill. I'm sure the government wants Labor support for this bill. That's possible if we can do something about part 4. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Honourable